Welcome to Hometown Talks with Save Davidson, coming to you from the Hurt Hub in Davidson. This is where we talk about preserving Davidson's small town quality of life by educating and engaging citizens in town governance through community advocacy and activism. I am your host, Denise Beal. This is the second in a multi-part series focusing on the Beaty property. Today's topic, the request for proposal process for the development of this parcel of land, also called the RFP process. To recap episode 1, discussing the Beaty issue is important because it was the culmination of citizen feelings on a variety of issues throughout town that pulled residents together on this single issue. And it was ultimately responsible for the formation of the Save Davidson movement that rocked our town in 2017. We felt this would be a great place to start for devoted Save Davidson followers to reminisce and hear untold behind-the-scenes stories, and for new followers to learn what those car stickers are all about. To provide a brief introduction on part 2 of this series, the town created a 12-person request for proposal committee for the development of the property and called it the Beaty Street Selection Committee. The committee and the process was led by former Assistant Town Manager Don Blowbaum. The committee's charge was to review the 6 RFP responses to develop the property and ultimately vote on the best plan. The final choice was the Luminous Plan, presented by a group calling themselves Davidson Development Partners. The Luminous Plan was the only plan that included a hotel and was the most densely developed plan presented. This led nearby neighbors to begin questioning the process and the reasoning for this type of development, since they believed that the land was purchased to be a park. Eventually, citizens from across town joined them. Joining me today to talk about the RFP process that the town followed are 2 of 12 citizens who served on the Beaty Street Selection Committee, Eric Giangiordano and Stephanie Amadio. I am thrilled to have them here to recount their experiences with the process and share their perspectives on this topic. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Good morning.
Let's just jump right in. Eric, I'll start with you. How did you learn that an RFP process would occur?
The first written indication that I had that town officials were privately shopping the park for development was in the March 2016 timeframe. So I had started making some private inquiries in the months thereafter. This land had been sitting here for 30 plus years. Everyone keeps saying park, including most of the public input, town studies and plans. But here it sits completely neglected, literally ignored. And so my question in my mind was, why and who and what is behind that? The actual moment in March 2016 was I'd had a meeting with a person that was well connected with Town Hall and Davidson affairs. They said, quote, I did ask about it, and they, meaning staff at Town Hall, said there was no way the current town board would ever consider preserving the pond and land. They said the parcel is on the town's regular list of parcels that they share with developers who are looking for land to develop in town, end quote. The core problem I saw there was that was an agenda that wasn't public policy, and it had never been disclosed to us citizens of Davidson who owned that property. And then there was the actual RFP, which was originally referenced in May 2016 and was formally announced and published in August of 2016, which is when the majority of the citizens of Davidson's actually found out about the formal RFP and plans.
Were you going to town halls at that time?
I would go to meetings periodically, but, frankly, I think like most of us, it wasn't at the level to truly be educated and engaged and thus aware. The RFP is a good example. The RFP was initially announced in a meeting in May. I completely missed that announcement in May. I sent an email to our neighborhood with some updates of various development and projects around town, including some questions on the Beaty property. And then 2 days later, they announced the actual RFP, which admittedly caught even me off guard. So, if I'm a benchmark for some of our naivety and lack of awareness as citizens and in a community, even somebody that did help represent the neighborhood did go to meetings once in a while.
You still didn't know.
Guilty as charged.
Stephanie, how did you hear about the RFP?
I heard about the RFP from a neighbor. We live on the North Main Street, which is the Noma neighborhood. And I had moved there in the fall of 16, and it wasn't until January 17 a neighbor approached me about the potential development of those 19 acres. And recall that I had at one point in '04 to '07 had lived in the Hobbs Hill neighborhood and thought I might have some familiarity with it, and asked and looking for a neighborhood representative if I would have any interest in that, given my familiarity. Kind of got dunked into it and realized that it was going to be looking for development for high-density residents.
How did you feel about that high density?
Still knowing a lot of those neighbors, I was very concerned, and also just in general with how the town was developing and the traffic impact it would have. Where we live, our property would not back up to that park, so it really did not have an immediate impact with regards to the perimeter of our property. But it was more about how, again, is it going to further impact the town, seeing a lot of high development come into the area. But also a part of me being a bit naive and trusting, and I had participated in elections in the past, and I know that our commissioners and mayor, for the most part, were good people, and that we had thought, as far as our town staff was certainly capable, thought, okay, we'll go through the process and see how we can potentially impact and direct and influence. And I definitely felt like after extending out to the town to get involved in the RFP process, because I was not invited, as I said, January 17, they seemed open, and so I felt like it was going into it that it was going to be a process and the outcome would be something reasonable.
Eric told our neighborhood what was going on, and I was like, it'll work out. Everything will be fine. They're not going to do something that is going to be detrimental to the area.
Oh, right. And definitely on that north side of town, as you come in on 115, which is also Main Street, you know, there is a different feel entering town on that side that seems somewhat neglected, perhaps, or it doesn't really have an official sense that you're entering into the town of Davidson, and it goes from 55 to 35 to 25 in a rather short distance. And so really thought, well, if there's something that's going to take place and stay in the charm and character of the town and perhaps make a better entrance into the town, and for us, even within walking distance, having some quaint retail options or a restaurant or a coffee shop or something like that seemed really appealing. So it was, but again, kind of going back to the naivety of it, of the town and this group will be able to influence and do something that's going to make sense. So I was really excited about being a part of this, thinking that we could do an asset for our town.
Stephanie sort of touched on it, Eric, but I'm going to start with you. How did you end up on the committee?
When the committee plans were announced, I discussed that with the other 23 residents of Hobbs Hill neighborhood and nominated by my neighbors to represent Hobbs Hill neighborhood, and then specifically requested through Don Blobum, the assistant town manager at the time that was orchestrating the RFP, not only because we were very familiar with the process and were engaged, but also just as a sidebar, I don't feel like this gave us any more higher authority or precedent than any other resident or citizen throughout the entire jurisdiction of Davidson. Hobbs Hill neighborhood is the only private property, with the exception of the one property for development up on the corner of Beaty 115 that directly adjoins the Clontz Beaty Park property. It adjoins it on three sides.
There was a vested interest there.
Yeah, I would say, the way I view it is, if I was in office, is every single citizen's input and vote and weight should be equal. But, our neighborhood happened to be, and that's also, frankly, why we probably paid a little bit more attention. This property adjoined three of the four sides of that neighborhood.
Stephanie, how did you get involved?
Well, as I mentioned before, a neighbor had approached me with just, again, about that the whole process was taking place, the potential for that property to sell for development. And on the 30th, I reached out directly to the town manager and the mayor, and just gave my background in history and requested if I could represent the Noma neighborhood for this development, and immediately had a response back from the assistant town manager that welcomed me on the committee, informed me this was actually January 30th because the next meeting happened on the 31st, the next day. So I requested to get copies of the proposals. At that point, the six initial proposals had been submitted, and the other committee members had time to review, so was able to look those over. But it was somewhat difficult to grasp fully just like with those initial drawings and some of the verbiage on it without, and of course, just being exposed within hours of the meeting as far as what kind of density level was being offered. But again, was quickly received and welcomed to be a part of the RFP process.
That's impressive. Both of you were really proactive in saying, hey, we want to be part of, because I think at that point, me personally, I barely was even tuned into what was going on.
Well, I think I had some, that emotional ties to Hobbs Hill from being a neighbor there. So I had that interest. I think for me, like vowing, all right, I need to get more involved and start certainly at the town level. So that's, I think, kind of triggered my interest and energy level and wanting to make that commitment away from, work and family to be involved. I feel like the town was received the interest well.
They were open.
I think they were open and I don't know if they were surprised, but perhaps had they done some posting in our neighborhoods, maybe they would have had more folks being volunteered. But at the same time, whenever the request came in, it seemed to be well received by the town to have another citizen on the committee.
Did you know that the land was originally purchased to be a park at this time?
When we moved to the Hobbs Hill area in 2004, we had heard, or we knew that property was owned by the town, and we had heard that the property at the end of Hobbs at the end of the cul-de-sac was slated for a park. Now, I was on the Hobbs-Julia Circle corner, and the property behind us was wooded and then right to the railroad tracks, which has some right-of-way. So we knew that wooded area prior to the right-of-way of the railroad was town-owned, and we knew that at some point that there potentially could be a road or an alleyway, because Davidson is big on connectivity. And so when we purchased that home, we knew that was a potential. There again, you kind of feel like your voice will be heard if and when, and the town's going to do what's right. So we really didn't worry about that necessarily. But going back to the other pieces of it, we knew it was slated for a park, but I did not have any history or know the history with regards to that the town specifically purchased that for a park, nor did I know that the developer of Hobbs Hill had given that land to the town, or it was an agreement between the town that some of that property would be used as a buffer versus potential development for residents or business.
Eric, how about you? Did you know?
Honestly, Denise, I think only colloquially. Like, I would venture to say 99% or more of the population of Davidson. I think, like most people, as Stephanie alluded to, when we moved here in 2008, I asked all the same basic questions that Stephanie alluded to, just to kind of generally vet me the intent and purpose of the property, because in this case, it adjoined three sides of that neighborhood, clearly told by our realtor and at least indirectly through town officials that same narrative, that it was going to be a community park. The term that comes to mind for me is it was nebulous. It was either nebulous or always parsed, which I think in hindsight there are some indications of some premise or purpose and some coincidental or accidental intersections of why that was. But I think that ambiguity is a key topic, because I think that gets back to process or lack thereof, and just the whole shift in this manipulation or focus on development. And we saw that play out publicly for 6 to 12 months in a very heated fashion about the he said, she said. Is it park or is it development? To that point, the most recent public input town study, including the 2012 station area plan and the 2014 Parks and Rec master plan, which was thereafter adopted, those plans both specifically identified the Beaty property for becoming a park. And the public input on those plans consistently said that it was to be a park. But then you had this counter narrative. We only kind of saw the analogy of the iceberg with the Titanic. We only saw or heard about 10% of the, that 100% of that other, I think, conflicting focus or ideology and agenda, focusing on the development potential of the property rather than the park. And so on page 15 of the 2012 station area plan, it states, quote, 3 major deficiencies exist in and around the station area. An area generally north of Delberg Street is currently underserved by public parks. A public park on the town-owned Beatty Street property would satisfy this deficiency. Page 17 of that same public study. Quote, a second large regional park should also be created within the Beatty Street property. The Beaty property was also referenced several times as a priority project in the 2014 adopted Parks and Rec Master Plan.
Can you share your thoughts about the process itself?
The general context of my impression of the process was that the only part of the Beaty RFP process and that before selling and developing public property, an open RFP should be undertaken. As many of us have said, public input on public property. However, in some other research that I've done, it turns out that that wasn't necessarily by the initiative of the assistant town manager who was orchestrating the RFP process, or even the former administration, including the main board. That's actually partially a requirement of North Carolina general statute.
I've already alluded to the fact that I felt like it was open to be invited, and in the beginning, you pretty much accept the rules and format that's laid out in front of you. At least I did, and so the process, kind of coming into it after it had been out there for 9 months, seemed to be very fast-tracked. And I know that I came in several months after the fact, but it seemed like the citizen input was on the back end of it. After everything had been vetted and a project selected, then they wanted the citizen input on that one specific project that the committee had selected. I think part of that was confusing, as you had multiple plans that the town has on their website as to how property is designated, and you end up finding out some of those plans have been adopted, some officially have not, so that makes it a bit confusing. And Eric pointed out some of those comments that were in some of those, the station area plan. And some of those did show parks, some of it showed open space, so it made it confusing as to why now all of a sudden the turn for development. But it was also, they had the dates aligned for, and laid out here's the meeting times we're going to have. Here's when the folks were going to narrow it down from 6 to 3 or 2, and then those developers will come in and give a presentation. And we were allowed to put together questions for the developers. Being a representative of the Noma neighborhood, we put together questions for the 2 finalist developers, but we also put questions together for the town that we felt like should have been answered prior to even having the discussion with the 2 specific developers that were interviewed. And we also found out with the process, the town's had this property. There is a history which has been touched upon in another podcast about when the property was at one point being considered for development for sale. But from what I understand, Blue Hill Development, which was one of the 2 finalists, DDP was the other for the Luminous, but Blue Hill had approached the town and looking for property for the church. And so the town had come out with this process saying, due to that interest, that is why this time we've triggered for an RFP process to come out, due to us being approached by a developer for this church, and part of looking at their past plans wanted to include some multi-use beyond just the church, which is why Blue Hill came out and included residential and some commercial for that property, because it was required by the town. And of course, ultimately, they weren't selected at the end of the day. It was the DDP Luminous proposal. It just seemed very rushed. When it came down to the vote on the committee, the option was you had to pick one. You could not, we had requested both in writing and in person. Can we hit the pause? This seems to be moving kind of fast. And now that we have a better understanding of what's being proposed, it just seems too dense. Has the traffic study or traffic impact study been completed? And other questions, of course, getting from the town we could not get answered. And at the end of the day, in terms of voting, I mean, Eric and I abstained from voting.
That last meeting was extremely awkward for everybody, even the town staff, as I'm sure it was an hour long. We had 1 hour for the third of the 3 collective meetings for the selection committee. Even the participants, even noting that we'd already documented the town on behalf of our neighborhoods and the community that we were abstaining in protest per the documentation we had sent, there was a back and forth narrative about, this feels rushed. There's a lot of, even the 2 sitting commissioners are involved and voted. I expressed that of 5 votes that were ultimately cast, not including the 2 of yours and mine, where we abstained and did not submit an actual vote, 3 of those 5 people, which is 60%, entirely missed the developer presentations in the key second meeting. That included the two commissioners and one of the citizens. So
they
60%
were
of
just
the
looking at
60% of the people that voted didn't even meet and interview the two finalists. We had some concerns because I think we had started to get a taste of the disposition of the climate, or maybe the decision bias, through our neighborhoods meetings the prior fall. Because it was like we would have the discussions, as you know, Denise, and then it was just kind of like, thank you very much. We'll take that into consideration. But I started realizing nothing was really gaining any traction, so that it was kind of like empty air. And I think when we all started the selection committee, again, in good faith, I think you step into a process and try to hope and expect the best of people in a process, that was the case. But after the first 2-hour meeting where 4 of the 6 proposals got tossed almost immediately, I was pretty livid. I mean, Michael Adams, who's another neighbor of ours that sat in and came as a guest with me that night, and he can tell you, we sat in the parking lot out behind Summit, and I was just livid and said, this process is absurd, and if this is indicative of how town hall's managing other projects, I just say it was disturbing.
It definitely felt a bit force-fed. Eric and I had not discussed going in there to abstain from that vote. I think we had each independently communicated our neighborhood's concerns and wanting to take a pause or a breath and let's go back and reevaluate this before making a final decision. So I really went in to that last meeting thinking that there was still an opportunity to delay and let's have some further discussion. And we had some independent meetings with some of the commissioners as well expressing our concerns. So we felt like we did a thorough job in communicating and was hoping it was going to be heard, but it was made pretty clear by the project manager at the time that no, a decision has to be made. You have to pick one. And that's when I said, well, then I abstain from voting because I cannot pick one. Could not get behind either of them, and felt like even questions we had, and it's funny, even in hindsight, I think had they taken into consideration some of our thoughts, and obviously none of us are residential commercial developers, but we had, there was pieces and components that we could get behind the development and the residents, but just due to the density and some of the questions that were unknown and where the placement of where they were going to put some of these properties did not make sense. And I even thought if they took out 25% of the residences, this plan might have gone through because there was some small percentage that was set aside that was going to be designated as a town park. So I do think for the developers, for the town, whoever was wanting to quickly develop this property, the opportunity was missed because it was being force-fed and underestimating the power of the town citizens. Certainly that could help overturn it. The outcome has been perhaps most ideal now, but it is interesting thinking back 2 years ago, we could be in a very different situation now had there been a listening ear.
Well, the concern for the rush to judgment was that the town had owned the property for over 30 years. So I think I can speak at least loosely for the entire group, including all the citizens, that there was a lot of head scratching going, why do you own an asset for 30 years and then this arbitrary or capricious process underlying drive to say, we have got to, I can tell you, even the people that initially were completely naive to some of the concerns going on with this, talking to them, I'm talking about citizens and people on this selection committee, thereafter look back and have made comments to me. In fact, I had a meeting with a few of the people from the selection committee, a month or two after this to kind of reflect on where this thing was kind of spiraling, and they admitted and said, yeah, that was probably one of the, yellow or red flags, was just, that narrative of 30 years, why do we have to rush to judgment in 3 months? That alone should be a part of a story of this for municipal projects to, when you start, I guess it's the old adage of when you kind of see something that just doesn't quite sit right in your mind, you should probably pause and ask some more questions like we were doing, and more importantly, compel intelligent answers.
And I'll just say it makes you jump to the conclusion that the town had a development in mind or developer in mind, regardless of the process and the vote.
The project was being backed into rather than pulled into. And I think one of the things we didn't explicitly mention is, a public input session. a series of public input would have really made a difference if the town was willing to listen.
To touch on some specifics for citizens and the community as far as process failures with the Beaty RFP, there were several. I would list three, not necessarily in any particular order of priority, but first was that the town officials arbitrarily decided the purpose and use of a public property, i.e. which we now know was density development via a public-private partnership, or PPP, that would involve the sale of the entirety of the land. The second process failure point was that they failed to do any historical records research on the property whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And third, based on a lot of the evidence that we as a community, including through the FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, and other legal rights at our disposal as taxpayers and citizens, discovered that there was a unilateral failure to disclose that tacit sale and development agenda, and again, first seek public input or approval on that. Arguably one of the most outrageous flaws of the RFP and the process itself, to me personally, was the fact that the entire premise for the RFP was false or misstated. And then probably secondarily, the other thing that struck me most vigorously was the collusion between one of the developers and town officials during the RFP process. Well, that's a whole separate issue. But it's important, like any project, that you get off on the right, accurate, transparent, truthful foot. And that didn't even happen with this RFP, and I'll elaborate briefly here. If you look at the FAQs, the frequently asked questions, the narrative that the town published in writing, it stated, quote, "Why consider selling the land to a developer now?" And then further quote, this is directly from town records, "In the spring of 2015, the Lake Forest Church approached the town planning department to discuss building a new church in Davidson." That part is accurate. To continue the quote, in January 2016, a developer presented a proposal to develop the Beatty Street property as a mixed-use neighborhood, including the church as a focal point, end quote. That part is categorically false. And I have written statements from individuals in town, as well as the FOIA documentation that we discovered through Save Davidson.
Public records documentation?
Yes, and here's why. Because neither the church nor Blue Hill ever directly solicited the town to purchase and develop the entire property for commercial or mixed use. In fact, just to clarify something, again, that was great that Stephanie alluded to earlier, and I've spoke directly to one of the partners of Blue Hill Development, and he attested to this publicly in writing as well. Neither Blue Hill nor the church ever solicited the town, as was described and presented to the public, to purchase or acquire the entire Clontz Beatty Park property for a commercial mixed-use development. We found out through one of the FOIA documents that was discovered that in April of 2017, one of the pastors at Lake Forest Church, very coherently and in good faith, emailed the town with a series of concerns and questions and confusion over this entire situation, and attested that the church's involvement prior to the RFP was solely the original inquiry about the possibility of purchasing 5 acres to build their permanent location. And that followed right after the rezoning, which facilitated that was adopted in April of 2015. And that was the 5 acres that we've already documented earlier in this podcast, was that corner of 115.
Wait, when was it rezoned, Eric?
It was rezoned. They originally proposed the rezoning in fall of 2014, and then they adopted along with all the other mass ordinance amendments that the previous administration had approved in April of 2015.
Which made it go from what to what?
So the property, great question. The property was originally zoned as village infill, which is what predominantly most of the residential and area around Davidson, downtown, the village proper is referred to as village infill. The planning department in the previous administration specifically created and crafted an entirely new zoning area called NC1, Neighborhood Center 1, specifically for the Clontz Beatty property. They also added a few parcels across Beatty Street up there along Shearer Road, where there's some of the affordable housing and some of our other neighbors and residents. So that was the premise. Also, to your point, the sole distinction between village infill zoning in this one-off Neighborhood Center 1 was to add 3 to 4 explicit additional development options that were automatically permitted, or as the town planning department often like to say, by right. And
what are those options?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. So the rezoning specifically was for the purpose of adding these 3 to 4 additional permitted zoning. And to clarify, the difference between conditional zoning and by right or specifically or explicitly approved already in the ordinance is huge. This is the context of the dispute with the Griffith Hyatt Hotel controversy that's in litigation. That was a conditional zoning approval, and that former mayor and board opted to approve that conditional approval. So when they approved the rezoning and created this neighborhood center one, several of the permitted uses that they added included commercial, mixed use, and lo and behold, a hotel.
So that was proposed or discussed in the fall of
2014.
Yep. But then it became adopted in the spring of 15 after the church had approached the town.
Well, I think based on the timeline, it was, and bear in mind, one of the partners at Blue Hill, and who I've had many excellent conversations with, think it was all following along the same time frame. They were involved and aware of what was going on in the town. So when the town rezoning happened, the church, just as a sidebar, churches are very restricted because of ordinance, because of few provisions on ordinances of where they can locate their property. So it was all entirely good faith. People at Lake Forest Church had a very short option, like any clergy in our area, of where they could locate property for a permanent home. That property happened to become one of them specifically. Just to finish clarifying the quote from that FOIA letter from the pastor from Lake Forest Church, he specifically reaffirmed that the church's involvement prior to the RFP was solely their inquiry in the spring of 2015 after the rezoning about purchasing 5 acres up on the corner of Beaty 115 to be their permanent location. And in fact, he later stated, quote, "At the time we made the request, we felt that the remainder of the site would be a perfect location for a park with nature trails, the pond, etc. We would have been willing to participate with the town in creating the park," end quote. But none of that, including that correspondence, was ever discussed or disclosed with the public, including the selection committee, which you and I participated in. So we had no knowledge or awareness of all that. Mm-hmm. Now, I can't delve into intent. My position publicly has always been in criticizing this process is it was a breach of duty either way, whether it was out of ignorance or intent. If we go kind of to a legal standard, it's really irrelevant for the fact that either way it was an error and a breach in duty.
And
frankly.
I think the bottom line is the process was just not followed, and I keep going back to that public input piece that should have come first before anything else happened. And the impetus for the RFP being someone approaching the town to develop is just wrong, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, in a nutshell, I think that the citizens in the town should dictate what we are going to do with this piece of town-owned land.
Transparently.
Taxpayer-owned land.
Yeah.
And it was more the town telling the citizens what would be done.
Well, and the RFP was also written in an exclusionary manner on the purposes and uses. Mm-hmm. So I kind of jumped off topic a bit, Stephanie, but to your point about the rezoning, to clarify legally, there are 13 and 21 permitted uses currently in DPO, Davidson Planning Ordinance, for Village Infill in NC1, Neighborhood Center 1, which again only applies to the Beaty Clontz property and a few parcels across Beaty. However, if you read the RFP, only 2 of those permitted uses were explicitly defined, were required in the way the RFP was written, which were commercial, mixed use, and residential. So even if you set aside all of the other, dozens or hundreds of discrepancies or issues or flaws with the RFP itself and the entire process, you could step away from this podcast and say, if there's 13 and 21 permitted uses for the property, what would be the theology or premise or basis underlying for why you would write a document and only specifically allude to and or require a handful of those?
Okay, so Stephanie, there were residential plans back in 1997, and it was a small neighborhood that looked a lot like the surrounding neighborhoods. And there was a citizen uprising of sorts, not like the one in 2017 that we had, but it was citizens did not want residential development on the Beaty parcels because it was purchased to be a park. Were you aware of that at the time of the RFP meeting?
Oh, I had no idea. No, I had no idea that was, or as I mentioned before, nor the history of how even the property was acquired from the Clontz family. But no, that was never discussed or brought up by the project manager.
That's one thing that I find really interesting, because the argument is that people don't want affordable housing here. I mean, I think citizens wanted it to be a park because it was meant to be a park. And they didn't want commercial development, they didn't want a hotel, they didn't want residential development, period. They wanted something for the entire town. Because it was almost the same exact, I mean, it was like in 1997, so it was a smaller uprising. But when you look through those petitions that we later got, it was citizens. You see addresses from across town saying, we want this to be kept as a park. Knowing that now in hindsight, after the process, how does that make you feel that we knew this happened before and we were fighting the same fight that citizens fought 20 years prior?
It's hard to pass along full blame because the existing staff were the staff in 2017, and the elected officials at that time, I think quite a few of them were not residents of Davidson in 1997. So it's easy to give somewhat of a pass to that. You know, Eric had mentioned what kind of due diligence was done on the property prior to sending out the RFP, which you can perhaps fault because, as we found out, there is public documentation and records of what happened in 1997. But I guess I feel like some of those folks, if they weren't living here, and how were they to know or even to ask some of those questions? And you can, of course, in turn, lay some blame as we got later into the late spring of 17 and even summer as to if you were an elected official, why you weren't asking those questions. And maybe they did. I don't know the answer to that. But for myself, I wasn't here in 1997, so having no idea until a lot of the digging took place.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting is we were seeing names of people who still live in the Hobbs Hill neighborhood and people we still knew around town. And some of those people were speaking up, which was really interesting. And to me, I would think that the town would say, hold on a minute, let's look into the minutes. And that's what the citizens did.
Right. Yeah, it took the citizens to do that versus the town. Like I said, going back to when the initial RFP came out and even through the January, February timeframe, but I can understand them not, those that had not lived here in that time frame.
Right.
But once citizens started voicing those concerns and making those statements, and we had a neighbor on our street who has been in her home since the 60s, and she brought that up to the rest of us who had not been here that long, of this issue's come up before.
Mm-hmm. And I think that if the town really wanted to research that information and find it, that they would have found it. But we were able to find it doing a lot of public information requests.
Well, we were able to find it because we looked, quite frankly, you know. And this is why I think, you know, I love what Save Davidson represents, because even as, you know, friends and peers and neighbors, we can all have differing opinions. I generally agree with most of Stephanie's opinions on these things, but and reciprocally maybe she doesn't as well. I tend to have a little bit of a harsher perspective on, you know, granting some, I don't want to describe this as how you described it, Stephanie, but, you know, more of you know, of an excuse for some of that. For example, one of the former commissioners who is involved in the planning and development industry that was not reelected, in fact, he actually chose not to even run. I don't think this is common knowledge, but he was one of the 3 people that actually responded to the 1996 RFP. So you and I weren't aware of that.
No.
Right. So
I had no idea.
So there's all
that was
these,
interesting.
and that gentleman also happened to be a staunch advocate of the RFP. So, you know, again, I always kind of litmus test things to a legal standard just to be objective and all that. So if the public narrative or the former administration said, well, we weren't around or in office, which was true, to Stephanie's point, she's entirely valid on that, but we didn't have any knowledge, that's categorically false in the case of one of the sitting commissioners who was one of the couple people that kind of drove the train with staff on the RFP, because he was involved and actually bid on the property or responded to it in 1996. So either there was some lack of recollection or some atrocious memory that would be hard to kind of just accept as just, you know, oh, I didn't know. And did some research through Save Davidson, and we publicly pointed out that the premise was not accurate as far as Blue Hill Development and the church, that neither one of them had ever asked the town or solicit them to buy the entire property for commercial mixed use. As you know, Denise, the more we dug as a community, just starting to scratch the surface, it was like we're being told there's no documents, there's no this, there's that. But yet the reason why there was none of that coming forthright was because nobody was bothering to ask or look. As soon as we started digging and looking, the more the pile of evidence started coming out, people stood back and said, wow,
And one of the other things is that former Mayor John Woods, I think he was in on a committee or a commissioner in that 1997 timeframe. Eric, do you remember?
I don't know. I know
He was involved in
I
town
think to his
government at that
credit,
point.
to former Mayor Woods' credit, he's a lifelong resident of Davidson, as understood. He was born and raised here, so he has extensive history in this town.
But I think he was on a committee.
He was involved because the RFP was in the 96 and 97 timeframe, and he was first elected to a commissioner role in the town of Davidson in 1997.
That's exactly what I
Yeah,
was
so he
getting
was
at.
commissioner for 10 years. He was reelected then 5 times as a commissioner. I think a few years after he was first elected, he became mayor pro tem, and then he was elected mayor in 2007 and served another 10 years as mayor.
It's reasonable to say that he was involved during that 1996 RFP and the petition writing process. And then nobody knows how that process ended. It just sort of poof ended, which is sort of an interesting thing, but he was there.
Perhaps the naive person in myself think, gosh, can I remember back what I did 20 years ago with great detail? No. So I think and I even think that with regards to the commissioner that you mentioned, who was commissioner through 2017, perhaps did he have the immediate recollection of what he bid on 20 years prior, or what an employee of his bid on, or whatever? So it's hard, I guess, again, I'm the naive one, or willing to give the benefit of the doubt that those folks may not immediately remember, but still, it's not the excuse to not do that due diligence once these
Open the
points
file.
started. Right, open the file, and even admit some, let me look into that. I don't recall, but let's get to the bottom of it.
Let's see
And
what we can
unfortunately, that, I think, led to the demise of at least the opinion from the citizens about those folks, and not get them reelected. But a good lesson to learn, both for the town of Davidson and other small towns, in terms of listen to your citizens and admit that you may not know the answer, and try to get to the bottom of it versus taking a stance and assuming no one else knows.
That's a great point. I wanted to ask both of you, and at this point, either of you could change a single thing about the process that the town followed and that you were a small part of. What would it be? Single thing.
One, I think we've already touched upon it, and that's citizen input from the get-go. Prior to any type of RFP, when it comes to citizen-owned property and assets.
As simple as that.
I think that's where it begins. And as I mentioned before, I think had that happened, we could have perhaps a hotel coming in or some type of development. I don't think the density would have been there like what was being proposed, but I do think a different result than it even being a park, a full 100% park as it's being slated for or agreed to today.
So more of a negotiation between town and citizens.
I don't think between town and I don't think a collaboration, not a negotiation, because it's the citizens own it. It's the town that's responsible for implementing what the citizens want to do. So I think citizen input from the beginning.
Very good point. Eric, how about you?
Well, as you know, I'm a process guy. I think that the town just simply needs to be far more proper and sophisticated in how it evolves and implements its processes and practices. I think is being done aggressively under the new administration. Citizens go to town hall, watch the board meetings, participate, and engage. That P-word process is repetitively brought up by the new mayor and board as far as areas that they've identified throughout town matters. Again, not an indictment to, say that everything that was done in the past was wrong or poor, but just that, you have to evolve. And I think we've well documented that, most of the practices up until the last 18 months today, were not materially much different then than they were in the old days, decades ago, when things were a lot more informal. And for example, we talked about process as far as park and rec and open space property. So when the town compels a private party to sell or donate their real property for conservation, that should be memorialized adequately in writing and appropriate legal measures taken to restrict or ensure compliance with those terms and conditions. As we now know, not only was none of that done with the Klontz family or the Johnsons, who developed Hobbs Hill and donated property for open space to be part of that project or that park property, But ultimately, the onus legally and from a process point of view is on the town to do that, since they're the ones dictating the terms in those documents, and that didn't happen. So it was just, to Stephanie's point, the nice thing about process is if you eliminate the entire narrative about intent, whether malicious or otherwise, you fall back on process. And that's why we have rules and regulations and processes in place to basically, if they're implemented properly by the right people and adhered to and followed and evolved from time to time with a process of continuous improvement.
I was wondering if there is anything that either of you would like to add to the conversation that we may not have discussed already.
Maybe one of the end stories of this whole controversy is, what can we learn? Because a tremendous amount of time and energy has been unnecessarily expended over a litany of some of these controversies. And I think, for a variety of reasons, this, the Clontz Beaty Park property, RFP, obviously struck a chord, not just with the community of Davidson, but, we saw with county, state representatives, the broader Charlotte, Lake Norman region and beyond. And so, one of the things I think that's great about this podcast and, the continuing advocacy that Save Davidson represents is to your guys' prior point, look at the irony. I've read those documents. The 1996 process certainly didn't end the way this one did, but the parallels are indisputable between that. They did do the right thing back in 1996 and said, hey, we don't support this. It was only 10 years removed from when they bought the property from the Clontzes. So it was still pretty fresh in their memory, to Stephanie's point about people's memory can lapse and all that. The process error that we as a community and those citizens in good faith overlooked in 96 was after fighting that fight, they, and I would argue more the onus was on the town officials back then, the history was there. The action should have been taken for some absolution on the property then, because it wasn't done properly as far as the records when the Clontzes donated the property, which was unfortunately on the town's lack of process.
And I know what we talked about so many times during the fight for this property is, okay, this happened in 1997. Now it's happening again in 2017. We want to make sure that this doesn't happen to citizens again.
Well, and I think citizen engagement, it's a reminder of how important it is to be engaged, because some of this information, be it not some about Beaty, but other developments, are available on the website. There are some postings. I think our current officials and staff are trying to utilize tools that they have today to let folks know of what potential developments are going on to gain that input and improving the process, as Eric had mentioned. But it's a reminder that we as citizens, we have to vote, we have to know who we're voting for, and we have to keep up with developments that are going on, because you don't want to just worry about the developments that are going to happen in as they say, in your backyard. You want to keep the town collectively in terms of looking at what's best overall for your neighbors and friends. And I think that's what Save Davidson has brought to the table. It initiated with the Beaty Park. I think its value is looking at across town developments.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you, and I think that even now you see less engagement. Less people involved, more people saying, "Oh, I hope everything's good with that." And
I now go to Save Davidson to get information. If I go to the town website, can be difficult to navigate and understand what projects are coming up and what's being considered. And so I look to Save Davidson as a resource to highlight what is happening with regard to density and development in Davidson.
People don't have a lot of time to sift through, and I'm glad that you say that, because that's what we strive to do. And a neighbor sent me a quote from a documentary, and I thought it just summed up the best way to prevent anyone from pushing you around is to stay involved and be in tune with what is happening around you. He further believes that things will not improve or change for the better by just watching from the sidelines and wishing they would. And I think everything we've all been through, none of us watch from the sidelines. And a lot of people give me personally credit for a lot of what happened. And I may have been the glue, but all the citizens being involved is what was so important, was magical about what we did. And without every single one of us, even someone doing the smallest task that they thought was insignificant, helped the rest of the process.
I've got Apple News, and I've got, there's several different news sources. So I want to get for the caption for the day. I don't read a newspaper. I don't want to go on, CNN or whatever news outlet to read all the articles. I just want the headlines. I kind of view that as now one aspect of what Save Davidson provides is it kind of gives you, here are the highlights as to what's going on. I mean, granted, it doesn't come as a daily media aspect, but it's a monthly recap. And that's how long it takes for things to change whenever the town commissioners are meeting month to month. It's that recap that's great to see.
And important for people to just follow along at the very minimum.
Right.
And I do worry that are people going to stop following along, not Save Davidson specifically, but town issues.
Right.
And that makes me nervous because you just never know. And it's people end up on autopilot, and we just need to be involved and aware.
Well, I think with rural area plan of 2017 had a different outcome if there had been more engagement and collective energy around it, like as what would happen with Beaty.
I think I agree. We've said that about a litany of things. As you know, I've done a lot of research on the My Connection debacle, and I'm firmly convinced there was pushback because clearly 2 or 3 of the other towns and the county of Mecklenburg strongly rejected the entire notion of the My Connection project. But in Davidson, we had a unanimous vote to approve that, which is kind of absurd and laughable in hindsight. But and this isn't to sound like a soundbite pitching Save Davidson, but in my heart, I'm convinced that as a community, if we had been more organized and vociferous in engagement with Town Hall, I don't believe the My Connection debacle would have ever happened. So think about, if you think about the value or impact of that, there's so many different ways that citizens can get involved, directly, indirectly. Donations is one way, but that advocacy was there, just like it was in 2007 when the My Connection decision was fatefully made. But I think, to me, Save Davidson's benchmark was, including the social media and the Facebook platform, was to provide an easy platform to help quickly engage citizens transparently and openly across the entire town and community. And I think that was
it's a checks and balance, really, and it's not to constantly point the finger and tell town what they're doing wrong. In some cases, you can applaud, certainly with the new administration, some of the directions that they've taken can be applauded. But it is nice knowing there is an organization out there that with the checks and balances, especially given how many people, forgot what the most recent number is, it like 140 people a day are moving to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area and take a drive on 77 at 8 o'clock in the morning, and you get a feel for that growth. But it's a time when we need that citizen engagement and development to be elevated.
Ignorance breeds injustice. And I believe in that, and I think a lot of the things that that Save Davidson and the community have advocated for in recent years is a perfect example. If we set aside all the other narratives and debates and arguments and marches and protests and all that, there was a significant, if not overwhelming, volume of ignorance on the part of Town Hall and elected and hired officials and us as a community. And that ignorance is what fostered a lot of missteps and injustice. And so whether it's the Beaty RFP, park property 2 years ago, or My Connection 10 years ago, and all the things moving forward, those processes will always be there. When you talk about political and municipal matters, you can kind of simply separate it into federal, state, and local. They're all important. Citizens and adults of voting age should be engaged reasonably in all 3 levels. But my personal opinion is that you will get the most bang for your buck and energy on the local level, because that's going to have the most impact, arguably, on your daily lives and those of your family and your friends and your neighbors and stuff. And so that's another argument for why this is so powerful, whether it's through Save Davidson or just to show up at town board meetings and be involved. It's very easy, as we saw with this case of this story. It happened in 1996 and it kind of got shelved and left alone, and then lo and behold, it reared its ugly head years later in a much more aggressive form. And thankfully to the community and the new administration and staff and Denise, you and all the other good citizens that have worked so hard on that Beaty task force for the park. So we've learned from that history, positive or negative or neutral, as people in a population and community, so that we can be more advanced, more intelligent about things now and moving forward. So that's powerful.
It is. Thank you, Eric. And thank you, Stephanie. At this time, I'm going to wrap up. I think we could talk about this topic for probably hours. And when we all get together, I think we do. There's no shortage of information out there. We look forward to bringing the next edition for you to learn all about the uprising and the drama that happened at the end of 2017. For now, this has been educational, and it's really good to get this history and your experiences out there. So thank you.
Thank you, Denise.
Yes, thank you for having us participate.
I want to remind everyone to sign up for the Save Davidson monthly newsletter, where you can get information about this and other important topics, read our blogs, and see historical documents on savedavidson.org. Check out the Save Davidson YouTube channel, follow us on Instagram, and to be part of the conversation, you can join us on Save Davidson, the official group on Facebook. Thank you very much.